He's killing me. I didn't have time for a prayer. I didn't even have time to cry. My lungs felt like they were collapsing, and the sound of Jason's boots against the hardwood was the only countdown I had left. I huddled in the dark of the laundry room, the cold metal of the dryer against my back. My phone vibrated in my hand, a cruel joke. 2% battery. Enough for one text. One goodbye. I typed the number from memory, my fingers slick with sweat. Help. Penthouse for B. He's going to finish me. I hit send just as the screen flickered and died. I thought I was reaching my father. I thought I was sending a map to my own body. But 5 miles away, in a room that smelled of expensive leather and old grudges, the message didn't land on a desk in a quiet suburb. It lit up the private phone of Vincent Moretti. The city calls him the King of Shadows. He doesn't believe in miracles, and he definitely doesn't answer calls from strangers. But as he read those 3 words, "He's killing me," sent to his encrypted line by a single-digit mistake, something shifted in his cold, grey eyes. He didn't call the police. The police worked for him. He stood up, adjusted his cufflinks, and looked at the shadows in the corner of his office. "Change of plans," he said, his voice like grinding stones. "Someone just sent a message to the wrong man, and I'm already on my way." The light in the penthouse always felt clinical, a sharp, expensive brightness that made the blood on the marble floor look like spilled ink. Emily lay there, the air trapped in her lungs, listening to the rhythmic, terrifyingly calm sound of Jason adjusting his silk tie in the hallway mirror. This was the man the world saw, the philanthropist, the visionary, the perfect partner. But as the sickening thud echoed in her mind, she realized the mask hadn't just slipped, it had shattered. It hadn't started with violence. It started with a slow, deliberate erosion. First, it was the 2 concerned phone calls to her parents, whispering that Emily was becoming forgetful, perhaps even delusional. Then came the public dinners where he would gently correct her in front of friends, his hand squeezing her wrist just a bit too hard as he told the table, "Emily's been under so much stress lately, she doesn't know what she's saying." He didn't just isolate her, he rewrote her reality. By the time he'd convinced her boss that her mental instability made her a liability to the firm, Emily was already a ghost in her own life. Jason walked back into the room, his shadow stretching across her like a shroud. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed, which was far worse. "Look at you, Emily," he murmured, his voice smooth as a whetstone. "Who would believe you now? To the police, you're the girl who stopped taking her meds. To your father, you're the daughter who won't stop crying wolf." He knelt beside her, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the metallic tang of fear. He had spent 2 years building a cage made of reputation and lies. He'd made sure that if she ever screamed, the world would only hear the sounds of a woman losing her mind. He reached out to stroke her hair, a gesture that used to mean love but now felt like a threat of more to come. "You have nothing left but me," he whispered. But as he turned his back to grab a roll of duct tape from the kitchen drawer, Emily's fingers brushed against the cold glass of her phone. It was dying, just like her hope, but she pulled it into the shadow of her hip. She didn't need the world to believe her anymore. She just needed one person to hear her. As Jason began to whistle a low, haunting tune, Emily typed the words that would change everything, her vision blurring as she sent a prayer into the digital void. She thought she was calling for family. She didn't know she was summoning a king. 5 miles away, the atmosphere was a stark, chilling contrast to the desperate chaos of the penthouse. In the inner sanctum of the Moretti estate, the air smelled of aged cedar and the cold, metallic scent of high-grade steel. Vincent Moretti sat behind a desk of carved obsidian, his face a mask of sculpted marble. He was a man who moved in silence and spoke in ultimatums, a king who had built an empire on the wreckage of those who had mistaken his stillness for apathy. His private phone, a device known to only a handful of souls in the city's underworld, vibrated with a sharp, insistent hum. Vincent didn't rush to answer it. He watched it for a beat, his grey eyes tracking the light of the notification. When he finally picked it up, the 3 words on the screen seemed to bleed into the room: "He's killing me." A single-digit error. A prayer sent to a man the world considered a devil. Vincent's jaw tightened, a hairline fracture in his otherwise perfect composure. He wasn't a hero, and he didn't believe in coincidences, but he had a code, a jagged, uncompromising line drawn in the sand. In his world, power was for conquest, for war, and for loyalty. Power was never meant to be used to break something that couldn't fight back. He loathed the hunters of the weak, men who hid behind silk ties and calculated smiles to destroy the vulnerable. To Vincent, a man like Jason Reed wasn't just a criminal, he was a coward, and in the Moretti ledger, cowardice was the only sin that couldn't be forgiven. He stood up, the movement fluid and predatory. He didn't check the number or verify the source. The raw, unfiltered terror in those words was all the verification he needed. He reached for his jacket, the fabric whispering against his holster as he shrugged it on. "Marco," Vincent said, his voice a low, controlled thunder that carried to the shadows of the doorway. A massive figure stepped into the light, eyes alert and hands ready. "So, trace the signal. High-rise district. Penthouse sector." Vincent adjusted his cufflinks with a chilling precision, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the walls of his office. "We aren't going there for a negotiation, and we aren't waiting for the sirens. Someone just tried to send a message to God, but they got me instead." He grabbed his leather gloves, pulling them on with a final, decisive snap. "Bring the heavy cars. We have a debt to collect from a man who thinks he's untouchable. Tell the boys, don't bother knocking." As he stepped out into the freezing night, the engine of his black sedan roared to life like a beast waking from a fever. Vincent Moretti wasn't just on his way, he was bringing the storm with him. The wood of the bathroom door groaned, a final, fragile barrier between Emily and the man who had spent years convincing her she was nothing. Jason's shoulder slammed against the frame, his breath coming in ragged, exhilarated bursts. "Did you really think a lock would stop me, Emily? You're having another episode. You're confused. Let me help you remember who you belong to." With a splintering crack, the door gave way, and Jason stepped into the small, tiled space, his eyes dark with a terrifying, predatory triumph. He didn't see the shadow behind him until the entire penthouse seemed to shudder. The front door didn't just open, it disintegrated. The sound was like a thunderclap trapped in a glass jar, followed by the heavy, synchronized rhythm of boots that didn't hesitate. Jason spun around, his face shifting from malice to confusion, but he was too late. Vincent Moretti stepped through the wreckage of the entryway, his dark suit pristine, his expression as unreadable as a tombstone. He didn't look like a man who had just committed a home invasion, he looked like a king reclaiming a stolen province. Jason tried to find his voice, the mask of the perfect citizen desperately trying to reattach itself. "Who the hell are you? This is private property. I'll have you." Vincent didn't raise his voice. He didn't even break his stride. He simply walked toward Jason with a terrifying, glacial calm that sucked the air out of the room. When he reached him, Vincent's hand shot out, catching Jason by the throat with the speed of a striking cobra. The sound of Jason's back hitting the marble floor was a dull, final thud. Vincent didn't strike him again. He didn't need to. He stood over Jason, one polished shoe pinning the younger man's chest down with enough pressure to stifle a scream but not enough to end the pain. Vincent leaned down, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the very air feel cold. "You spent a long time making this girl feel small, haven't you, Jason? You like the sound of breaking things." Vincent's gaze flickered to the red circle of the hallway light, his eyes tracking the man on the floor with a lethal, focused intensity. "But you've never met a real monster. I'm the one the monsters pray to." In seconds, the man who had been Emily's entire world of terror was reduced to a shaking, wide-eyed heap on the floor, rendered utterly powerless by a dominance he couldn't comprehend. Vincent turned his back on Jason as if he were nothing more than a discarded shadow, his gaze softening only when it landed on Emily. He reached out a gloved hand, his presence a wall of iron between her and her past. "Don't look at him," Vincent commanded gently, his voice the first safe thing she had heard in years. "He's finished. You're with me now." The first thing Emily noticed wasn't the pain, but the silence. It was a heavy, expensive kind of quiet, devoid of the frantic ticking of the clock in Jason's penthouse or the muffled sounds of a city that had spent 2 years ignoring her screams. When she finally forced her eyes open, she didn't see the clinical white walls of a hospital or the familiar, suffocating shadows of her old life. Instead, she was met with the warm glow of amber lamps and the intricate carvings of a ceiling that looked like it belonged in a cathedral. She tried to sit up, but a sharp lace of fire across her ribs pinned her back to the silk sheets. A soft, rhythmic sound caught her attention, the slow turn of a page. Vincent Moretti sat in a high-backed leather chair by the window, the morning light catching the sharp angle of his jaw. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket now, his sleeves were rolled up, revealing the dark, intricate ink of tattoos that disappeared beneath his watch. He looked less like a businessman and more like a warrior at rest. "Stay still," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to steady the air in the room. He didn't look up from his book immediately, giving her a moment to find her bearings. "The doctor sedated you. You have 2 fractured ribs and a concussion. You're safe here." Emily's throat felt like it was filled with glass. Where is here?" Vincent finally closed the book and stood, his movement fluid and predatory even in his stillness. He walked to the edge of the bed, not close enough to crowd her, but near enough that she could feel the sheer gravity of his presence. "This is the Moretti estate. No one enters these grounds without my seal. No one leaves without my word. And Jason Reed is currently being handled by people who specialize in making problems disappear." Emily looked past him, through the tall arched windows. Outside, she saw stone walls topped with iron spikes, men in dark suits patrolling manicured gardens with a disciplined, military gait, and a gait that looked heavy enough to withstand a siege. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning ran down her spine. The realization hit her with the weight of a physical blow. She hadn't just escaped a predator, she had been claimed by a king. The walls around her were beautiful, but they were thick, and the man standing at the foot of her bed held the keys to every single one of them. For the first time in years, the door was locked from the outside, but it wasn't Jason holding the key. It was the man the entire city whispered about in the dark. "You're a guest, Emily," Vincent added, his grey eyes searching hers with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "But in this house, my guests are under my shadow. That means you are untouchable. Rest. We have much to discuss when the fog clears." By the 3rd day, the heavy silence of the Moretti estate had begun to feel less like a vacuum and more like a workshop. Vincent had provided her with a laptop, a sleek, unmarked machine with enough processing power to crack a small nation's firewall. He didn't ask her to use it, he simply placed it on the mahogany desk in her suite and left the room. It was an invitation, a silent recognition that the woman he had rescued was not a victim to be shielded, but a weapon to be unsheathed. Emily's fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly before the familiar hum of the cooling fan centered her. For 2 years, Jason had told her that her obsession with data was a cute little hobby that made her look unstable to her colleagues. Now, as she bypassed the encryption layers on her own seized cloud drive, she realized why he had worked so hard to make her doubt her own mind. The deeper she dug into the mirrored directories Jason thought he had wiped, the colder the air in the room seemed to become. She didn't find just bank statements or hidden folders, she found a digital skeleton, a complex, parasitic backdoor program woven into the city's primary banking systems. It was a masterpiece of malice. Jason hadn't just been stealing, he had built a ghost gateway that allowed a rival syndicate to siphon millions in untraceable microtransactions. and every single line of code, every digital footprint, and every biometric authorization was tied to her name. He didn't just want to control me, Emily whispered, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her wide eyes. He was building a cage out of my own talent. A shadow fell across the desk. Vincent was standing in the doorway, his presence as silent and imposing as the stone gargoyles on the estate's roof. He didn't move toward her, respecting the boundary of the desk. "What did you find, Emily?" "A death sentence," she replied, her voice gaining a sharp, clinical edge as she turned the screen toward him. "If the federal authorities look at this, they won't see Jason Reed. They'll see me. He's used my credentials to build a laundering system for the Volkov family. I'm the black box for $40 million of their money." Vincent leaned in, his gaze tracking the cascading lines of code with a dark, appreciative intensity. He didn't look surprised, he looked like a man who had finally found the missing piece of a puzzle. So, Jason isn't just a coward who hits women. He's a traitor to the city's equilibrium. Emily looked up at him, the fear that had defined her for years beginning to crystallize into a cold, hard resolve. "I can close the back door, Vincent. I can lock them out and trace where the money went. But if I do, they'll come for me. Not just Jason, the people he works for." Vincent straightened, his hand resting briefly on the back of her chair, a solid anchor in the storm. "Let them come," he said, his voice a low, lethal promise. "They'll find that the door they built leads straight to me." The illusion of safety shattered with the single, shrill chime of a burner phone left on the bedside table. Emily reached for it, her heart hammering against her healing ribs, and the image that flickered onto the screen drained the remaining color from her face. It was a photo of her younger sister, Maya, sitting in the back of a van, her eyes wide with a terror that Emily knew too well. A moment later, Jason's voice crawled through the speaker, devoid of the polished charm he showed the world. "You always were too smart for your own good, Emily," he sneered, the sound of a heavy sliding door closing in the background. "Did you think hiding behind Moretti's walls would make me go away? You have something that belongs to me, and to people far more impatient than I am." The ultimatum was cold and surgical. Jason didn't just want the money, he wanted her soul on paper. He demanded she unlock the digital black box, transfer the $40 million to a new offshore account, and sign a notarized confession taking full responsibility for the entire laundering operation. Sign it, and Maya walks. Refuse, or try to involve your new pet monster, and I'll make sure the only thing your father receives is a closed casket. The phone went dead before Emily could scream. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of the digital skeleton she had uncovered now feeling like a noose around Maya's neck. She felt the sudden, grounding presence of Vincent behind her. He didn't need to see the screen to know the air had changed, he felt the shift in the room's gravity. "He has her, Vincent," Emily whispered, her voice cracking as she clutched the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. "He wants the signature. He wants the full guy. He's going to kill her if I don't give him everything." Vincent stepped into her line of sight, his expression a terrifyingly calm void. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her everything would be fine. Instead, he reached out and took the phone from her trembling hand, his thumb tracing the screen where Jason's number had been. "He thinks he's playing a game of leverage," Vincent said, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating register. "He thinks your sister is his shield. He doesn't realize she's just become the reason I'm going to erase him from this city's memory." Emily looked up at him, the fear for her sister clashing with a new, burning desperation. "I have to go to him. It's the only way he'll let her go." Vincent's gaze locked onto hers, grey eyes flashing like steel in a storm. "You'll go," he promised, "but you won't be surrendering. You're the detonator, Emily. And I'm the blast." The air in the abandoned industrial park smelled of stagnant river water and rusted iron, a desolate graveyard of industry that Jason had chosen for his final act of theater. Emily stepped out of the black sedan, her legs feeling like lead, but her mind sharper than it had ever been. In her pocket, a small, unassuming USB drive weighed more than an anchor. It was the kill switch she had spent the last 12 hours perfecting under Vincent's watchful shadow. Beneath her high-collared coat, a microscopic wire pressed against her skin, a cold reminder that while she walked into the lion's den alone, the King of Shadows was listening to every breath she took. Jason was waiting in the center of a hollowed-out warehouse, standing beside a tied and gagged Maya. He looked manic, the thin veneer of his gentlemanly charm finally stripped away to reveal the hollow, desperate man underneath. "You're late, Emily," he called out, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls. "I almost thought you'd chosen the mobster over your own blood." "I'm here, Jason." "Let her go," Emily said, her voice steady despite the frantic thrumming of her heart. She held up the drive. "The back door is open. The 40 million is staged for transfer. All I need to do is hit execute and sign the digital confession." Jason's eyes lit up with a greedy, feverish light. He gestured for one of his hired men to bring a laptop forward. "Do it. Then we can all go back to the way things were. I'll forgive you for running, Emily. I'll even forgive you for him." As she sat down at the makeshift desk, Emily didn't look at the men circling her like vultures. She looked at Maya, sending a silent promise with her eyes. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with a practiced, lethal grace. She wasn't transferring money, she was planting a logic bomb. Every keystroke was a tether, linking Jason's private accounts and the rival syndicate's hidden servers directly to a federal sting server Vincent had anonymously tipped off. "Almost there," she murmured, loud enough for the wire to catch. She could hear the faint, rhythmic static in her ear, a signal from Vincent. He was close. The trap wasn't just for Jason, it was for the entire network that had enabled him. As she finalized the confession, she didn't type her own name. She embedded Jason's unique biometric signature into the metadata of every illegal transaction. "It's done," she said, leaning back as the progress bar hit 100%. Jason stepped forward, a triumphant sneer twisting his face as he reached for the laptop. He thought he had won. He thought he had his fall guy and his fortune. He didn't realize that the moment he touched that keyboard, he had signed his own death warrant. The silence of the warehouse was suddenly broken by the low, distant rumble of a fleet of engines approaching, and the shadows in the rafters began to move. The rumble of the engines didn't just announce an arrival, it signaled an execution. The corrugated steel of the warehouse doors didn't stand a chance as the black SUVs breached the perimeter, the screech of tires drowning out Jason's panicked demands. Before he could reach for Maya or the laptop, the shadows in the rafters came alive. Flashbangs detonated in a blinding, rhythmic sequence, turning the world into a stuttering roar of white light and thunder. Through the haze, Vincent Moretti appeared like a phantom born of the smoke. He didn't run, he didn't need to. He moved with a glacial, terrifying purpose that froze Jason's hired muscle in their tracks. The men Vincent brought with him were surgical, neutralizing the threats with a disciplined silence that made the chaos feel orchestrated. Jason scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the air as if he could grasp the power he had already lost. "You don't understand. I have the data. I'll delete it all," he shrieked, his voice cracking into the pathetic register of a cornered rat. Vincent didn't stop until he was standing a mere foot away. He looked down at Jason, his grey eyes devoid of heat, filled only with the cold satisfaction of a predator who had finally caught a nuisance. With a movement so fast it was almost invisible, Vincent's hand closed around Jason's collar, lifting him nearly off his feet. "You spent 2 years making her feel small," Vincent said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that cut through the ringing in the warehouse. "You thought the world was your stage because no one was looking. Well, I'm looking now." Vincent didn't waste a bullet. He didn't need to. He threw Jason toward the center of the floor, where the red emergency lights of the warehouse cast a circular, crimson glow, a target mark for a man whose reputation was already dead. Jason hit the concrete with a sickening thud, the breath leaving his body in a pathetic wheeze. He looked up, his face a mask of broken pride and genuine, soul-deep terror, as Vincent's men moved in to restrain him. Emily stood by Maya, her hand steady as she worked the knots free from her sister's wrists. She didn't flinch at the sound of the confrontation. She didn't hide her eyes. For the first time in her life, she watched the man who had been her monster lie broken on the floor, and she felt nothing but a cold, crystalline clarity. She wasn't the girl in the laundry room anymore. She wasn't the victim waiting for a blow that never came. She looked at Vincent, and in the wreckage of the warehouse, amidst the sirens and the dust, she saw him watching her. He didn't offer a smile, but he inclined his head, a silent acknowledgement from one power to another. The man on the floor was no longer her nightmare, he was just debris. Emily stood tall, her shadow stretching long and sharp over the man who had tried to break her, finally and completely unafraid. The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the marble halls of the courthouse, a sound that finally silenced the ghosts of Emily's past. Jason Reed, stripped of his expensive suits and his carefully crafted reputation, had been led away in shackles to serve a sentence that ensured he would never again cast a shadow over another person's life. The digital evidence Emily had unearthed was irrefutable. It had dismantled not only Jason but the entire corrupt network that had shielded him. 6 months later, the air was crisp and clean on the balcony of the Moretti estate. Emily stood at the railing, watching the sun dip below the city skyline. She was no longer the woman who huddled in dark corners or whispered apologies for existing. Her posture was certain, her eyes reflecting a quiet, hardened strength. Beside her, Vincent moved with his usual silent grace, 2 glasses of dark wine in his hands. He didn't offer a celebratory toast. They both knew that peace wasn't something you toasted, it was something you defended. "The final transfers are complete," Emily said, her voice steady. She wasn't talking about offshore accounts or laundered millions for the mob. Using the very backdoor Jason had built, she and Vincent had redirected the seized syndicate funds into a new kind of infrastructure. The first 3 shelters are fully operational. Encrypted communication, armored transport, and legal teams that can't be bought. No one else has to wait for a wrong number to be saved. Vincent leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the city he had always ruled through fear, but which he was now helping Emily reshape through justice. He had been the king of shadows, a man who believed power was a solitary burden. But looking at Emily, he saw a different kind of sovereignty. She hadn't just survived the dark, she had mastered it. "You've turned his cage into a sanctuary," Vincent murmured, his voice a low, appreciative hum. Emily reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his dark coat. She didn't lean into him out of desperation anymore, but out of a choice made in total freedom. "We did," she corrected him. The city lights flickered to life below them, a sprawling grid of millions of souls. In the thousands of apartments and houses, there were still people living in silence, waiting for a sign that they hadn't been forgotten. But as Emily looked out over the horizon, she knew the new reign had begun. It wasn't built on blood or fear, but on the promise that when a cry for help went out into the void, there was finally someone listening on the other side. The doors were no longer locked, and for the first time in her life, Emily Carter was exactly where she was meant to be, standing in the light, beside her king.